Welcome to another episode of the Movie Geeks United Art of the Score series. Daniel Pemberton is one of the most innovative composers in the industry, and by all accounts, he's just getting started. His mood-tinged themes for the supernatural horror film The Awakening caught the ear of director Ridley Scott, who quickly cast Pemberton as the composer of his film The Counselor. The result was a pastiche of haunting and surprising cues, unlike anything we currently hear on the film score front. His follow-up was Guy Ritchie's feature film treatment of The Man from U.N.C.L.E., for which Pemberton provided an exhilaratingly rich and amusing score, peppered with all the eccentricities and fun of the 60s-tinged spy genre itself. Now, Pemberton takes his talents to the next level with Steve Jobs. Alongside director Danny Boyle, Pemberton brought the spirit of experimentation to the forefront, composing for period instruments, structuring an original opera, and using technologies invented by the man whose biography Pemberton was serving.
Because what fascinates me about this film is that it has a very unique three-act structure, and it seems like all the creative decisions that went into it kind of followed that unique direction. And so I was wondering if you could describe to my audience how that translated into your approach for the score.
One of the first things we talked about was, the way the script was. So obviously, split into three different acts. And he described the first act as vision, the second act as revenge, and the third act as wisdom. And so we had this idea of trying to write the film in three parts musically. And I came aboard very early on the film, before they started shooting. So that felt like quite an interesting route to take. So the idea was the first act was going to be this kind of optimistic vision of the future, where technology was going to change, how we felt about how technology was going to change the way we lived. And I thought the thing that symbolized that the best was the synthesizer, because it was a sound of the future. It was a sound of great potential, but also very, very part of the era of 1984. So I limited myself just to equipment that came from that time, from 1984 or before, to write that part of the score. And then the second act is set in an opera house, so we decided to let's write an opera. That just seemed like the sensible idea, and so we ended up, writing a whole opera for that act. And in the third act, by 1998, the iMac has launched, and it's kind of achieving the potential of what Steve Jobs, his belief in what computers could do for people. And so we tried to write that act. Our starting point was writing that with it inside the computer, because I write now everything on an Apple, using Apple software. So I used that as a starting point for writing that act, which was a lot more introspective and emotional and more like sound design based. So that's kind of how we started off.
Going back to the first act, so you're working with synthesized instruments from that period in the early to mid-'80s. Did you find that the possible limitations of that equipment forced you to be more kind of creative with your musical solutions?
Yes, definitely, because it was very, it was fascinating to go back to using just synthesizers. I had synthesizers you couldn't even control through MIDI or any kind of sort of language. You had to play them in by hand. They could only play one note at a time. They'd go out of tune. So all these things made you think about how you'd write music differently. And it was kind of the way people in 1984 had to think about writing music. So it was quite fascinating to go back and revisit that part of the score as if I was in that era. As I say, we used a lot of classic synthesizers like the CS80, which Yamaha CS80, which is like the Vangelis synthesizer, which you used on Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire. And Steve, I know Steve was very influenced by Chariots of Fire. That was used in the original Macintosh launch. It was used, that synthesizer, on the original Macintosh advert by Ridley Scott. So these are all kind of sort of nerdy little details that I tried to get in there.
And it seems like so much of the movie is kind of one big, bold experiment. And which mirrors a lot of what Steve Jobs epitomized as well. Was there always a fear of whether or not what you were doing was going to work?
Yeah, definitely early on, we didn't know if this was going to work as an idea. The film is a very experimental film in terms of the way it approaches, most experimental, I think, very groundbreaking and exciting way of approaching the material. So because I came on the film right at the beginning, we could try these things out and we could, we could fail. It didn't matter if it didn't work. We always had time to come up with something else. But, we're all very pleased with how it's turned out, I think.
So you say that you started the process of working on the film before even a frame of it had been shot. That has to be rare, isn't it?
I think it is rare. I think it's sad that it's rare because I like to get really, really involved with the film. So as soon as I got the script, I started writing music, and I was sending that to Danny, who was shooting out San Francisco, and he would be getting my music before they even started shooting the film. And we'd talk about it while they shot the film, while they were rehearsing the scenes, and that would influence the way he shot. And the notes he'd give back to me, or the rushes I'd see, would influence the way I worked. And so it meant we could temper the whole movie with all my music. So everything in the music, everything in the film, comes from one source. It's not like tons of other movies. And it means, as a composer, you have to give up a hell of a lot of your time on a project, but then you're completely part of the project. I really like working that way. I think it's a very intensive way to work, but I think it means you can get music that's more experimental and more exciting, because I think there's so much you can do with film music, and I think so often it just sounds like scores you've heard before, and I try, wherever I can, not to do that.
Well, we talk about that a lot with every person on a film crew, but particularly actors and composers, because people think in terms of actors being typecast, but there's also the danger of composers being typecast as well. A director coming to you and saying, I want a sound similar to what you did in this. But that must make it an extra joy to work with somebody like Danny Boyle, because he seems to be a filmmaker who's very adventurous and absolutely wants something new that hasn't been seen or heard before.
Yeah, that's the kind of people I gravitate towards working with, because I always want to, I've been really lucky. The directors I've worked with, like Ridley Scott, Guy Ritchie, and Danny Boyle, they are all directors who really appreciate and really understand the importance it can bring to a film. And they always want something that sounds new and different. So I've been very lucky to work with really good directors like that. And I really, for myself, love trying something different each time, because the way I get all my scores, I try and make them sound very different. I want to just inhabit that world and not necessarily force whatever I think is right. I try to absorb the world of the film and then work out what's right for it, rather than say, this is my sound, stick it on the film.
Well, you just mentioned Ridley Scott, and I got to tell you, I love your score for The Counselor.
Thanks.
I listen to it all the time, and I was just recently, I saw an interview with him where he was talking about the kind of the nihilistic overtones of the movie, and I was wondering if musically, if that's something that you responded to when you started working on it, what your thought process was about scoring that film.
Again, that was an interesting film, because it's a very difficult film to immediately grasp how to score, because all the films I seem to have done, they're not immediately apparent. There's not an obvious way of scoring them. Like The Counselor is a very different film as well. And again, I worked very closely with Ridley's editor, Pietro. And again, it was trying stuff out while we were editing, not coming in at the last minute, but working alongside the filmmakers through the process, that allowed us to create something, I think, a bit more unique, hopefully.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And also back to Steve Jobs, you talk about a lot of the films that you work on. They're not necessarily it's not necessarily apparent how music will play a role in them. And with Steve Jobs, you also have Aaron Sorkin's beautiful dialogue, and you want to leave room for that and not overpower or step on that. Was that a challenge as well?
Yeah, that's incredibly. That's the most important part of the film. When I first got the script, it was like 185 pages. I remember reading it thinking, "It's amazing. It's like dynamite." But what am I going to do? I love the script. But I did think I'm not going to have to do much here because there's no space for music. That was a big challenge because it's like, how do you make music that's bold, has an identity, but doesn't overpower the dialogue, doesn't get in the way of the dialogue? And a lot of the music I wrote early on, we found was, while it's very exciting musically, it overpowered or got in the way of the dialogue. And we had to give that space, so we ended up stripping lots of things back, making it so that is the key to the film, and all I really need to do as a composer is serve the storytelling aspect of the film. And by giving the dialogue the space it needed was a very important part of this score.
Mm-hmm. Did film scores, did they play a major role in shaping your musical consciousness as a young person?
Yeah, I kind of absorb everything. So, growing up, I was massively into synthesizer music, so it was really fun for me to come back and play with synthesizers. I bought a bunch of synthesizers I never thought I'd actually get to use in a professional capacity, and now I could, so that was nice. But, I grew up on everything, John Barry, Morricone, just like old TV themes from Britain, as well as, electronic music. Anything. I like absorbing as much as I can, but I am a bit of a film music sort of geek as well, so.
Do you, if somebody asked you, because we have a lot of people that love film score on the show, if someone asked you for your top 3 recommendations from the history of film composition, what would you say?
Oh my God, that's a hard one. I'm trying to think what things I really like. That's such a big question, but in terms of I just come up with 3 things I think are great. Solaris by Cliff Martinez, I think is an amazing score. In terms of the beautiful way it uses sound, texture, and it felt like something that every composer was massively inspired by. You get a score that changes everything, I think, and that was a great example of one of those. Navajo Joe by Ennio Morricone. I'm a massive Morricone, and I just love the absolute bonkersness and boldness and strength.
Yeah.
For me, that's something that's like someone saying, I can do anything with film music, look what I'll do. I love that score. And then let's pick a John Barry one out. Which John Barry one should we go? I really like the Knack by John Barry. It's got a great swing, amazing Hammond organ playing. Just feels really cool. So I don't know. There's 3 random scores from nowhere. You mentioned that you're a film music geek, but as for myself and for my other friends that love film scores, there was a time when we would buy hundreds upon hundreds of film score CDs and LPs, and we collected them because we loved them so much. But that's kind of changed as the music industry itself has changed. How would you define that change? And what do you think we're missing by not having as many kind of physical releases of film scores out there? I don't know, it's weird because I love physical release, and even the Steve Jobs soundtrack or the Man from U.N.C.L.E. soundtrack, I've spent a good deal of time analyzing how long the second pauses should be between each track. And you think, who cares about that? No one cares. But I got that kind of detail of just the ordering, the mixes. I always try and make the albums as good as possible. And the physical release for me is that is my sort of perfect rendition. I want the score to be listened to. But At the same time, I don't listen to scores that way very much these days. I stick them on shuffle. Like even on Steve Jobs, we couldn't fit everything on a CD because there wasn't enough space. So there's like one extra track on the digital just because we couldn't fit it on the CD. And you get more on the digital. It's easy to put more stuff in. I don't know. It's all different. I mean, my favorite is the physical format, but then I love, if you go to Spotify, you type in Ennio Morricone and you hit shuffle, it's insane. It's an insane experience. And I'd like to one day someone be able to do that with my name and enjoy everything that comes up.
That's it for this episode of the Movie Geeks United Art of the Score series. Daniel Pemberton's score to the new film Steve Jobs will be available for purchase on October 23rd.